Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we will talk about Muslim anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a daughter of Dutch Holocaust survivors, and in 2006, I emigrated myself from Europe to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Dimbler-Miller. I'm the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust Theater Project, then edgeofthewedge.com. I grew up in Elgin, Illinois in the Midwest with very few Jews, not a Holocaust community. Our parents and grandparents had come to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. Yet in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, my husband, a US Army officer, and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Raheel Raza is a Canadian journalist originally from Pakistan, and she is an author and an activist for Muslim reform. She's the president of Muslims Facing Tomorrow and co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement and of the Clarity Coalition. All three organizations stand for advancing Western values of liberty in Muslim communities and defeating Islamism. She also chairs the steering committee of the non-profit Council of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, the Council of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, and she regularly speaks up against anti-Semitism in various media outlets. Raheel Raza is recipient of the Canada's Sesquicentennial commemorative medal for exceptional contributions to Canada, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for service to Canada, and the Museum of Tolerance Medal of Valor. Raheel, it's an honor to have you in our show as our guest. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you.
I get to ask the first question today, which is, please tell us a little about your background and how your personal background, and how it motivated you to do Muslim reform and fight against Islamism.
Thank you. As you had mentioned, Evelyn, I was born and grew up in Pakistan. And at the time that I was growing up in Pakistan, it was a very different country. It was pluralistic and religiosity was not thrust down our throats. I studied in co-education and I studied in a convent college and school. So it was tolerant, it was different. But then around the end of the 1970s, a dictator by the name of General Ziaul Haq introduced Pakistan to Islamism and extremism. And he was very attracted to Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi ideology that came from Saudi Arabia. So this was the time we decided to leave. And we went initially to the United Arab Emirates and then migrated to Canada. Now, it's ironical. Imagine coming to a non-Muslim country to find Islam. And I did. I found Islam in Canada. The people, they reflected all the qualities, the tolerance, the pluralism, the kindness, the mercy, the compassion. And, that is the ideal. And, we were at peace because this was such a good decision and it was wonderful until things started changing. And then around the early 90s, I saw that the same ideology that we have left behind was making its way into Canada, which is Wahhabism and Khomeiniism. I'm sure maybe your listeners know that Islam and Muslims have many denominations. The two largest ones are Shia and Sunni. So Wahhabism is what emanates from the Sunni world, and Khomeiniism from the Shia world, and both of them are political ideologies, which is what has harmed us the most. So we had two choices. Either we could be swept away by what we saw happening around us, or we could have stood up and challenged it. And that's exactly what I did. So for us reform-minded Muslims, and I need to clarify that when I say reform, what I mean is not to reform Islam, but to reform the way that Muslims understand, perceive, and implement Islam in their lives, the way they take it on in their daily lives. And, and for us, there was really no choice. We had to take on the battle for the soul of Islam because we are observant, practicing Muslims, and we wanted to see the change from within. And of course, 9/11 changed everything. We had to face our own demons. When 9/11 happened, it was, of course, extremely troubling and shocking, but it wasn't a surprise. We knew that there was something that was going to happen. We just weren't sure what it was. And the first Sunday after 9/11, a friend of mine who was a minister at a United Church called me, and she said, Raheel, I need a Muslim to come and speak to my congregation. And I literally, just jumped into that. And I went, and we all cried together, and we talked together. And that's when I realized that there is so much dialogue that needs to take place in order to understand each other.
And what was it you saw change in Pakistan when al-Haq took over the regime?
When Ziaul Haq took over, first of all, he brought in Sharia. And for those who you may know, Sharia is a set of man-made laws. They are not divine laws. Many Muslims have been brainwashed into thinking that they are. They're man-made laws, and they're mostly anti-women. So he implemented Sharia laws that were very, very anti-women. He implemented segregation of genders in the schools. He implemented nationalization of the schools. He implemented that, women who were coming in the public sphere, for example, in television and in the public, needed to cover their head. And that has never happened before. We were always free to dress as we pleased, to practice our faith as we pleased. And most importantly, he was divisive among the Muslims who had lived together. There are 70 sects in Islam. And it wasn't something that divided us, but he started this division because he was a hardcore Sunni. And the Shia-Sunni division became much more pronounced during his time. And, these were the problems we saw, and they were all against the very core values of what we believed our faith to be.
So it became more orthodox, so to speak?
More totalitarian, more orthodox, yes.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have to be careful when we use the word Orthodox in terms because of Orthodox Jews, etc. So I like that more totalitarian as the description.
Yes, I think definitely I would say it's more totalitarian, authoritarian, because these were issues that were forced on us.
Exactly. Exactly. That's.
And I agree with you. I will correct myself. I agree with you. If somebody wants to be orthodox in the way they practice their faith, I don't have a problem with that. But if you want to impose it on someone else, that's where we have an issue.
Okay, because I think that's very well defined. So give us a little feel for what kind of Muslim reform you would like to see happen and why. I think you've actually answered why, because I don't want to speak for you. Go ahead.
Well, it's very important to see Muslims come into the 21st century, to embrace modernity. They can't keep going back to the 7th century for examples, because once they come into the modern world, into the 21st century, they'll automatically interpret Islam in a way that conforms to modern liberal values. And I'll give you a very specific example. In the 7th century, when Islam came as a faith, they had the concept of armed jihad. Now, these were tribal communities. The only way they knew how to interact with each other was through armed jihad, was to fight. They had no round tables that they sat around. But today, we are looking at nation states. We are looking at the United Nations for whatever it's worth. And so we need to put that concept of armed jihad in the 7th century parking lot. That is a term that I came up with. A lot of the concepts that existed in the 7th century need to be parked in the 7th century parking lot, and we need to move ahead, as many other faiths have done. You take polygamy, for example. You know, it's something that needs to be put away. It did exist. There was a certain reason for it,
Yes.
which is explained. If you look at slavery, it did exist. But today, we don't want to be part of any community that accepts slavery. And of course, it does exist today as well in many parts of the Muslim world. So this is what we want, is for Muslims to embrace the values of gender equality, of nonviolence, of tolerance, of pluralism, and also to, very importantly, to accept LGBTQ rights. That is a huge issue in the Muslim world. You know, we're all aware of what's happening at FIFA in Qatar as the World Cup is playing out. I've lived and worked in Qatar. It's not as though that an LGBTQ community doesn't exist there. It does, but they're creating such an uproar about it. And these are the ideological changes that we'd like to see in the Muslim world, is to be accepting and tolerant of everyone else if they want respect for themselves. You know, we want to all respect and support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, not the Cairo Declaration, which was a much later construct, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that is the kind of reform that we'd like to see. We'd like to see Muslims en masse, go speak out against violence, against social injustice, against politicization of the faith. But it doesn't happen.
It's interesting to me also because it reminds me of many aspects that the Jewish people and the Jewish religion had to adjust while in diaspora and while time was progressing, you know, and the world changes all the time in the case of the Jewish people, but now also in the case of Islamic people, many Islamic people, the environment also changes. You know, there is now also a Muslim diaspora, so to speak. So
yes, you're so right, Evelyn.
yeah,
You know, people have to learn to change as time goes along, because nothing remains the same. And we have to adapt our religious and social values to the changing times. Now, for that, of course, you need dialogue and discussion, something that is sorely missing from large Muslim communities. You know, they just are totally stuck on dogma. They are not open to different interpretations, which I think are very possible. And that is part of the work that Muslim reform does, is to say, okay, so let's see if this can be interpreted in a more tolerant way, in a way that will adapt to today.
Raheel, how many, what is the proportion of Muslims that want that kind of reform that you just explained to us? And does that differ in various parts of the world?
You know, surprisingly, there are many more than you would think. Now, the only problem is that they hold back for various reasons. It's one thing to say that they want the reform, and when we talk to them and we have a large community gatherings, they all believe that, yes, this is important, but to ask them to speak about it publicly or sign a document about it, they're afraid. And their reasons are social and community pressures, fear of ostracization. You know, they're brainwashed in the mosques when they go there, brainwashing by the mullahs who are saying, no, 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 you must stick to this and you shouldn't step outside, and reform is not really acceptable in Islam. Of course it is. It was a reformist faith from day one. But the fact that it has been, that the regulations have been frozen in time is a big problem for us. So yes, not as many, I wouldn't say en masse the world over, Muslims accept it. And it also depends on where they're living. You know, with education, with enlightenment, the change comes. But if you look at Muslims in third world countries, where education is not something that exists, they don't have the ability to read and think and interpret the way they should. So what happens is they become slaves to the mullahs. they are then subject to what the mullah says. And the mullah, of course, is usually the village idiot. And excuse me for saying that, but that's exactly the reality. Somebody who's not only uneducated in secular education, but has no deep information about Islam as well. So, now I would say that in North America, for example, Muslims are much more enlightened, much more educated. So there is a lot of hope here. And this is where the change is coming. This is where you see a lot of the reforms coming, the change coming. And in the Middle East, it's a whole different ballgame because it's very politicized. Everything is seen in the light of the politics of the area. And, they're so caught up in that it's very hard to talk about reform.
Right. Let's change to the subject of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
In all the Muslim populations around the world, the amount of anti-Semitism is much higher than in other populations, according to the Anti-Defamation League, and also other surveys have found that. In Holland, I experienced it personally. Why is there so much anti-Semitism in the Muslim population?
You're absolutely right. There is a high percentage of anti-Semitism in Muslim populations because it's the easiest tool in Muslim nations to whip up hysteria and score political points. And once again, what I had mentioned before, the level of education and knowledge comes into place. When people are totally illiterate and ignorant, you can feed them any kind of mass propaganda. And that is exactly what it does. And, politicians use it as a tool to rile up the masses. Now, you'll be interested to know that I'm in the process of actually completing a documentary on this very topic.
Oh.
And chosen my land of birth, Pakistan, as the first case study. So I went there in March for 3 weeks and I interviewed everyone from top level down to grassroots to understand where this is coming from. And hopefully over time, we'll be able to see this together. And, it was very educational and interesting for me in this process to learn that anti-Semitism manifests itself as hate against Israel, against the Jews and Zionism. But when you talk to people, they use these terms interchangeably. For example, they will say, oh, I have nothing against the Jews. It's Zionism that I'm against. Oh, I have nothing against Israel, but we ask them about the right of Israel to exist, and suddenly there's deep silence. They'll say it's about the Palestinians, but they use the word human rights without really ever acknowledging their own abysmal, dismal human rights records. So it's very subjective and hypocritical.
So in the Middle East, it has a lot to do with what people are told about Jews, and many don't read, don't write, so that's what they believe.
Yes.
As I said earlier, I have experienced a lot of Muslim anti-Semitism in Western Europe, so countries like Sweden or Germany or Holland or France or Belgium, England. You see a lot of hatred against Jews up to the level of kill all the Jews, Hitler should have finished his job, stuff like that. These people from the Muslim population, and it's not everybody, of course, in the Muslim population, but they can read, they go to school, they have a normal education level for Western European standards. So where do they get those ideas?
Well, these are ideas that come from a lot of their superiors. It comes from the top down. And yes, there is a rise of anti-Semitism across the world, in Europe especially, but let's say even in North America. It's not just happening in Muslim societies. It's happening all over the world. I mean, what better example can I give you than Kanye West, who now calls himself Ye? I mean, every day he opens his mouth and he says something that is so vile, and he will argue that it is not anti-Semitism, but saying that he admires Hitler is absolute anti-Semitism. So we live in a world of social media. We live in a world where young people are very influenced by what happens. And social media is rife with anti-Semitic tropes. They are disguised under different different words and ways, and they would swear that this is not anti-Semitism, but it is. And that is what we have to understand. And this is why, for me, it's so important that people accept the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? And in Europe, I believe that the leaders of these countries are not clamping down hard enough on those who are spouting anti-Semitism and those who are promoting on anti-Semitism. There should be very strict laws about that. And I've seen it when I've traveled to Europe. But it will not change until their change comes from the top down, as well as education on the ground level. And so this is, the biggest global battle in my eyes, the battle against anti-Semitism, and all of us need to be involved.
Tell us about how you're involved. What do you do to battle anti-Semitism, and what would you like others to help you in your fight?
Well, one of our mandates in one of my organizations, the Council of Muslims Facing Tomorrow, is what we call the 3 E's. And this is to expose, educate, and empower for change. So first of all, we have to combat the disinformation that is out there. Whether people are brainwashed through religion, whether they're brainwashed because of politics. And I'll give you an example of the Muslim world. Many Muslims have been convinced that the holy book, the Quran, says, justifies their hatred for the Jews. But that is so wrong. If they had ever read, they would understand that the Quran very clearly says that Israel is a land for the Jews. So they don't have an argument there. But this is the problem. They're not reading. They are not educating themselves. They're just listening to propaganda. And that is, so we have to kill the propaganda. We have to have an alternate counter narrative that then clears many of the misconceptions. Many Muslims that I have talked to don't know about the role of the Mufti of Jerusalem.
Why don't you tell our listeners?
Yes, many, and I would say majority don't know. So we have to have clarification on these issues. They don't know the history of Israel and Palestine. They have ignorance about the facts, or the facts have been misconstrued, and we know that, and that's what all the propaganda is about. So I would say that what would help reduce Muslim anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism across the world is to have proper facts, to have an alternate narrative, to have more dialogue. And this is where I think the Abraham Accords are going to be key in how the change comes. For me, the biggest change came in my life when I first visited Israel about 15 years ago. And every misconception, every stereotype I had was absolutely killed, because it was a person to person, it was a human contact. And that is so important. There's nothing that I would love more than take a group of disbelieving, doubting Muslims to Israel and let them see for themselves. Let them meet the people. Let them understand what the history of this country is. And, promoting the IRA definition among different communities. I want to give you a very sad example of what is happening right here in Canada. So the University of Toronto actually did an entire study on this matter about anti-Semitism, concluding that a tool to understand and regulate anti-Semitism was not necessary. So if our educational institutions are rejecting that anti-Semitism exists, we have a problem, right?
Yes, we have a big problem.
We have, and this is where a hub of much anti-Semitism is, it happens in educational institutions
Yes.
who don't reject outright those who, it starts with words. It starts in small steps. I know that. And then if you don't stop the words at their very beginning, they then become bigger. And this is.
That's my play title. Many people don't get Thin Edge of the Wedge. That's what it means. If you let it get so wide, there's no turning back. And that's why it's so important we do something now. So
Yes.
I want to thank you for everything you do. My concern from looking in is that every week when someone goes to the mosque, certain mosque, you understand, I'm not saying all.
Yes, I understand.
It's just hammered. It's like I spent a lot of times reading about Hitler's speeches, etc., and how you brainwash people. Well, if you go to a mosque every week, okay.
They brainwash them, yes.
Yeah, and I don't know how you can stop that then. I really don't.
Where is that, Phyllis? Which part of the world are you talking
No,
about?
in any mosque that's this, in other words, that leans to the right or whatever we want to call it. But if the we would call it the sermon on synagogue or something every week,
yes,
is anti-Semitic, I don't know how there's any hope. I mean, I hate to be
also in
pessimistic.
America?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, very much in America. Very much in America and North America, where they use their freedom of speech to actually just stay under the red line, under the radar. But as I said, it's all about words. Of course, in parts of the Muslim world where there is no such restriction, it's full of hate. But this is happening all over the Western world, where there is anti-Semitism being spouted. Now, the good news is that we read a research in the Washington Post some time back saying that only 25% of Muslims are mosque-going Muslims. So that is where the hope is, to be able to reach the other 75% before they tip over to the other side. Is to be able to have that dialogue. I don't see that dialogue happening at a large scale. There needs to be much more dialogue, interaction, discussion, but people are, afraid of, and I don't blame them for being afraid, but that is where it can be killed. And then if there is hate and anti-Semitism being spouted in some of the mosques in North America, there need to be restrictions from the top down. I mean, it's in our laws that you can't promote hate. So why don't they stop them? We have exposed many of the imams who have been anti-Semitic or, who have been spouting hate. And that's what we have to continue to do. We have to expose them. We have to not be afraid to stand up and speak out. Of course, that comes with its own cost of, death threats and intimidation and lawsuits, but that doesn't stop us. When what we've taken on is very important, to have Muslim voices specifically speaking out against anti-Semitism.
Yes, I have looked also and asked around about the leadership of mosques in Europe and in Western Europe and in North America, because you can also see that in the last part of my documentary there is really calls for killing all the Jews coming up sometimes in sermons in mosques. So who are the leadership? And I was shocked that in most cases the leadership is Islamist. In other words,
yes,
very strict and political.
Yes, political. Of course,
totalitarian, as you mentioned
yes.
before. So it's not the reformers who are leading the mosques. Whereas in North America, if you look at Judaism, Reform Judaism is the biggest denomination within Judaism, but in the Muslim population or community, that is not yet the case, right?
It's not the case by far. Of course, we have these small institutions and mosques that have sprouted up that are reformist, that are tolerant and liberal. And we met two of the imams at our Clarity conference. And there is hope that more will come. Again, this is a time thing. Maybe it won't happen in my lifetime, but I'm hoping that the next generation of Muslims will say enough, and they will set up their own mosques. At the moment, the mosques are in the grip of the Islamists. But again, I also blame the leadership who is watching this happen and allowing it to happen.
Can we talk about, I don't understand the word leadership. Of course, I understand in English, but I mean, in Western European countries, they frequently have a chief rabbi. We don't have a chief rabbi here, but different groups of Orthodox Jews have the rabbi or someone else whose teachings they follow. When we talk about Muslim leadership, who would it take? Who are they that would need to change the public rhetoric? Did I ask the question? Is it?
Yes, and I understand your question. Now, the imam of a mosque in any country is chosen by the community. Doesn't have to have immaculate credentials. They just choose the imam. So they deserve the imam that they get. And very often in North America, they import the imams from the home country. So in a mosque where Pakistanis go, for example, they may bring an imam from Pakistan. And, depending on the nationality of that particular community, they don't really check the credentials. And when I say leadership, I mean the political leadership of the country that we are living in. This is part of their job, to see that hate rhetoric is not taking place in places of worship. In no synagogue or Hindu temple or a Buddhist temple or Christian church are they promoting death to another community, or are they promoting hate? So why is it allowed in mosques? And this is a question that we have to ask our elected leaders. We really have to put their backs up against a wall and say, why are you allowing this to happen? Because they will go, our elected leaders will go to the same mosque for votes.
Who are the elected leaders? That's what I'm still not following.
Our members of parliament.
Okay.
Yes, our members of parliament. And of course, leading us in Canada is the prime minister. And of course, in the US, you've got the president, but then maybe they're too busy to look at these smaller things. But our elected members of parliament, this is their responsibility. But again, in many governments, there is infiltration by the Islamists. So it goes in their favor to just be quiet and act like nothing is happening. But it's our job as Reform Muslims to expose what is happening in these institutions, these mosques, and continuously make public aware.
I've seen both in Dutch politics and also in American politics that Islamists sometimes become part or influential on government and on elected officials, mayors, also sheriffs. If I look at the leadership of the Western Jewish communities, the rabbis and Jewish organizations in Holland and here in America, they look for dialogue, as you also recommend, the interfaith dialogue also with the Muslim community. But then they pick the Islamist organizations as their dialogue partners. Am I correct in that observation? And if
Absolutely.
If so, who should they? Because Islamists, you cannot change in their ideas. They are prepared to die even for what they think is God's word, and you won't change it. So what do you think of the usefulness of dialoguing with Islamist organizations, or even the harmfulness of it, and what would you recommend instead?
That is a huge problem. The fact that the Islamists have infiltrated in every section of the community and the government, and sometimes it's difficult for Jewish communities to know who they should partner with. But this is when we recommend that they come to people like us to check. Now, the litmus test for us is to ask if they believe in the right of Israel to exist and defend itself. And usually you'll get the answer right there. I absolutely 100% agree with you, Evelyn, that the kind of interfaith dialogue that has now become popular and sexy is, you know, we talk about your latkes and our samosas, and it's about Hanukkah and Christmas and Eid. They're not really talking about the issues that matter. And this is very much to the benefit of the Islamists, who are so happy because, you know, they say, oh, here we are, we're talking with the Jewish community. So how can you call us anti-Semitic? But this is a huge problem. Now you look at CAIR in the United States, and you know, the Council on Islamic
CAIR, right?
CAIR, and its cronies in the USA and elsewhere, and Muslim charities that give funding to terrorist groups like Hamas. They need to be thoroughly scrutinized. How often has a Jewish organization who is partnering with a Muslim organization gone into the background and scrutinized who they are? Where is their funding coming from? What are their values? Now, for us, in our organization, Muslims Facing Tomorrow and the Council of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, we are totally transparent. You know, we can be scrutinized anytime because it's so important to do that. You know, check out these organizations before you partner with them. And if you're not sure, come to Reformist Muslims and check with us, because we pretty much know what is going on. It's so popular for the very same Islamist organization and Islamists to say, oh, we're against anti-Semitism. But they're the very people who are spouting the anti-Semitism. So we need total transparency. We need honesty. And so that is what Jewish organizations should look at before partnering with any Muslim organization, even us.
I absolutely agree. Now that we need to have, as we get near the end of this, what can individuals listening to this podcast at a grassroots level do to help reduce Muslim anti-Semitism and to support Muslim reform?
To talk to Muslims, you know, come together, support the Council of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism, to support those Muslims who are doing this work. I'll tell you, it's a very lonely path that we are on because we're sort of squeezed from both sides. You know, the Islamists hate us because we're talking about something that they don't believe in. And the other side is always a bit suspicious and leery. But as I said, we're totally transparent. Check us out. Go to the Muslim Reform Movement website, the CMA website, our website, and see who we are, what we do. And then find ways to dialogue so that we can negate the hate propaganda. It's very, very important at every step. And if the Jewish community, in their battle against anti-Semitism, can have Muslim voices with them, it makes a big difference. This is not a battle for the Jewish community alone. This is a global battle. And each and every one needs to be part of it. Wherever we see hate, we have to put it out.
I totally agree with you. I think as Jews, we should partner with those Muslims and Muslim organizations that are for universal human rights, that are not for totalitarianism.
Yes.
Instead, we are doing the opposite. But I think we should stop that and, you know, look a little bit further and a little bit deeper until we find Muslim reform organizations that we can help also in their own reforming activities, and that can help us with tolerance.
Yes.
I think that also Jewish leaders need to be educated about the difference of Muslim groups. That's another step.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end, and we want to give our guest, who's been so wonderful, a chance. Is there anything that you'd like to end with that we haven't discussed?
Well, I want to say that this is a long and uphill battle, and it's going to continue for a long time. Already we've seen that by our silence, the anti-Semitism has grown, the hate has grown. So if we as Muslims don't want xenophobia or racism against us, we must do the same for others. And so the most important thing is our humanity. For a moment, let's put aside our religion, our faith, our culture, and talk about humanity. And for me, that is a very important concept. Human to human, we must support each other. And that is what I'd like everyone to do, is to reach out and embrace somebody who is not like them, somebody who is different, and not to be afraid to ask hard questions. That's what we are here for, to actually answer the hard questions. And some of us may never agree on some things, and that's okay. We need to also respect our differences. We are not alike, but in many ways, we are also alike.
That's beautiful. And if only we could get people to follow that advice, the world would be so much better. I thank you so much for this really enlightening talk. I thank our listeners. Anyone who has not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again, it's now, please do. And it really ties into what we're talking about today. You can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can learn more about my nonfiction Holocaust play at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we close every show, we say, without putting yourself in physical harm, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.